He is risen.
He is risen indeed.
That's right. He is risen indeed, and that's why we're here this morning. And man, what an amazing time to just celebrate with our family. Hope you got here early enough to eat some breakfast. If you didn't, you missed out big time. If you did, you know it was awesome. And we've got a lot of stuff going on this morning. But here's what we're doing this morning is we're putting a spotlight on Jesus. That's why the church exists. That's why we try to cultivate a family. That's why we love our neighbors, is because of Jesus, because of who Jesus is. And so this morning, we're trying to do everything we can to spotlight him, to turn the attention away from ourselves and to put it on him. So this morning, we opened with a passage that I want to read again, because this is why we're here. Matthew 28, verse 1. Now, after the Sabbath, after Jesus had been crushed, after he had been tortured, after he had been stabbed in the side with a sword, a spear, after that, after he had been confirmed dead and put in a tomb, after the Sabbath, toward the dawn of the first day of the week, Mary Magdalene and the other Mary went to see the tomb. And behold, there was a great earthquake. For the angel of the Lord descended from heaven and came and rolled back the stone and sat on it. And his appearance was like lightning, and his clothing white as snow. And for fear of him, the guards trembled and became like dead men. You know, I don't know if you've ever seen something so brilliant, so amazing, that it actually stunned you and it made you tremble a little bit. Maybe you've been at a height that you knew how high it was. You'd been told how high it was, but when you got over to the edge and you realized how high it was, your hand began to tremble a little bit. Your heart began to beat a little bit faster. Some things are so big and so brilliant and so beautiful that the sight of them makes our heart race and our hand tremble. And this angel shows up and the men fall as dead because they are incredible. And the angel said to the women, "Do not be afraid, for I know that you seek Jesus who was crucified. He is not here, for he has risen, as he said. Come see the place where he lay, then go quickly and tell his disciples that he has risen from the dead. And behold, he is going before you to Galilee, and there you will see him. See, I have told you." So they departed quickly from the tomb with fear and great joy and ran to tell his disciples. And behold, Jesus met them and said, "Greetings." And they came up and took hold of his feet and they worshiped him, because that's the correct response to someone who used to be dead and came back to life. See, when somebody can come back by their own power from the dead, the proper response to that kind of power is worship. It's not proper to experience that kind of power and ignore it. It's not proper to experience that kind of power and dismiss it as if it just happens every day. The proper response to someone who you saw ripped apart and beaten so you could not recognize him, and then take his last breath and die, and then to see him alive by his own power, the proper response is to worship. And that's why we worship when we gather. Every time we gather, we're gathering a king who lived a perfect life, was slaughtered on a cross, and rose again by his own power. And that's why we worship, and that's why they worship. That's the proper response to that kind of power. And then Jesus said to them in verse 10, "Do not be afraid. Go and tell my brothers at Galilee, and there they will see me." And while they were going, behold, some of the guard went into the city, and they told the chief priests all that had taken place. And when they had assembled with the elders and taken counsel, they gave a significant sum of money to the soldiers and said, "Tell people his disciples came by night, and they stole him away while we were asleep." Still a very popular theory for the empty tomb. "And if this comes to the governor's ears, we will satisfy him and keep you out of trouble." So they took the money and they did as they were directed, and this story has been spread among the Jews to this day. Now the 11 disciples went to Galilee, to the mountain to which Jesus had directed them. And when they saw him, they worshiped him, but some doubted. And Jesus said to them, All authority in heaven and on earth has been given to me. Go therefore and make disciples, make followers, make students of all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father and of the Son and of the Holy Spirit, teaching them to observe all that I have commanded you. And behold, I am with you to the end of the age, which is only possible if he's alive. For him to make the claim that he's with them to the end. You know, when you look at this passage, there's some things that we need to just declare about the reality of the resurrection. And maybe you're here this morning and church isn't really your thing. I just want you to know why we put so much confidence in the resurrection. There's a couple things. One, these are super ancient texts, you know, back to the first century. And it's really interesting, in the first century, women couldn't testify in court. Nobody would respect a woman in the first century. So it's an interesting thing that a first century writer would say that women were the first people who testified to the resurrection of Jesus. Why would they do that? It would be much easier to write the women out of the story. You want people to believe in the resurrection of Jesus and the reality this is true. Whatever you do, don't make women the first witnesses. In the first century, that just wouldn't fly because their testimony didn't matter. And yet the writers want to write exactly what happened, the true story of what happened. And so they write it as they experienced it. And even if it would have gone against the culture, they let us know that two women were the first people to see Jesus alive. And a second thing, some people think that they experienced a ghost. Except in the first century, that was a pretty common experience. I actually talked to somebody last week. I was having coffee with somebody, and they were talking about how they've experienced ghosts. I don't know if that's been your experience, but there are still people who are like, hey, you know, ghost experiences are real things. That happens. People experience ghosts. And that was an experience in the first century. People would have known the difference between a ghost and somebody they could touch, talk to, put their hands around, someone who could eat food. They would have known the difference between a ghost and a person. And there's language for ghost encounters all the time in the first century. Nobody ever followed a ghost. Just I want you to know that. No movements were started by ghost encounters in the first century. None. There's not one movement that still exists that ever lasted longer than the person who had the ghost experience. There were no followers of a ghost from the first century. Jesus was alive, he was encountered, he was touched, and they were following him. Look at the third one here. The third artifact is hundreds of eyewitnesses. So in 1 Corinthians 15, there are hundreds of people who see Jesus, touch Jesus, encounter Jesus, not the least of which is the brother of Jesus. Now, how hard do you think it would be to convince your brother that you'd risen from the dead? I know my brother would be skeptical of any claims that I could make to being perfect. He knows me through and through, and the brother of Jesus is one of the ones who before the death of Jesus goes, I don't believe in you. You say you're God, you're my brother. Okay, that's just weird. Okay, in fact, his brothers tell him, you need to shut up about telling people you're God. That's just weird, you're embarrassing us. Okay, my brother has talked to me that way before. Hey, don't tell anybody you can shoot a basketball. You're just embarrassing us, okay? Just pass the ball, don't pretend like you can shoot. People are laughing because they know some of those stories about me playing basketball. The brother of Jesus doesn't believe in Jesus before he dies, and yet after he is risen from the dead, puts his confidence in Jesus. So hundreds of people. Paul says in the first century when he writes this letter, if you don't believe Jesus came back from the dead, there's 500 people. Most of them are still walking the planet. If you want to go talk to them, you can go talk to them. So much that first century historian Josephus said that there are so many people who said they've encountered a resurrected Jesus that the whole city's talking about it. Josephus wasn't a Christian, by the way, just a historian of the first century. And so hundreds of people encountered a risen Savior. Look at this next one. Number 4. Many of those eyewitnesses died a brutal death instead of recanting what they saw. So, I can get making up a story, but if you tell me to tell you the truth or I'm going to die, I'm going to just tell you the truth. I don't know about you, but I'm not going to hang on to a false story at the expense of my life. Might have worked out for a minute, but hey, if you're gonna put a sword to my head, and most of the people in the first century who put their confidence in Jesus died by the tip of a sword, or died in prison, or died in the lion's den, or fed to the lions in front of the crowds. That was the life of anybody in the first century who said, hey, I follow a resurrected God. I put my confidence in him. And most of those people died a brutal death for their confidence in Jesus. I got a few more of these. I'm not done yet. Check this out. Number 5, people didn't climb off a Roman cross. Romans were super good at killing people. They were the bomb at that. Like nobody was as good as the Romans, and the cross was their shining moment. That's their thing that put them on the map for like, we're really good at this torture, killing people thing. It was so brutal, for example, that a Roman citizen could not be executed by a cross. It was too dehumanizing. It was too embarrassing. It was too brutal. So if you're a Roman citizen, you could be executed for a crime, but you couldn't be executed by a cross. Which is one of the reasons why Paul, who's a Roman citizen, if we were here during our series in the book of Acts, did not die on a cross because he was a citizen. And they couldn't put him on a cross legally. No one crawled off a Roman cross. And if perhaps Jesus crawled off a cross and wasn't yet dead, no one tortured the way Jesus was tortured would ever convince anybody that he had died and risen again. You got to understand, your face could not be recognized. Skin ripped off your back. If for some reason you might still be alive and you grab a disciple or two and you say, hey, still here, you're not convincing them that you resurrected. You're not convincing them of really anything. Maybe you're just alive. So if for a chance he did crawl off that cross, he doesn't lead a movement because he didn't rise from the dead. I got 2 more just because you thought I was done, but I'm not. Number 7, religious cult leaders would often rise up in the first century. Over and over and over again, religious cult leaders would rise up in the first century. And over and over again, Rome would slaughter the leader. They did it, it was like a pastime. Because people hated Rome. So religious cult leaders would rise up, gather a movement together. Hey, we're taking back the city. In fact, there were many Jewish leaders who tried to push back Rome. And they just killed the leader. And this always ended the movement. Always. Always. No movement continued after the leader was killed. Ever. It was over. Done. Overnight. This is how you end movements. You kill the leader, and if they have a couple followers that are still pretty like, well, we'll pick up the mantle, you kill them too, and then it's over. Which is what happened to all the disciples, by the way. Every disciple except for John is slaughtered. And yet the movement is 2,000 years later on a part of the world thousands and thousands of miles away from where it started. Movements were killed and stopped all the time in the first century. Why wasn't this one? And then my last one. The first followers of Jesus changed the world by following the simple instructions he gave after they saw him alive. They had simple instructions. We just read them. Go into all the world and make disciples. Make other followers, teaching them all the things that I taught you. And how are you going to do that? I'm with you. I go with you. And I hold all authority and all power. I own the universe, the stars and the sky and everything that's here. I own it. It belongs to me. And I want you to go into all the nations. And so what was tribal became international. What started in a language is now in every language on the planet that we know of. Because the disciples saw him, had a front row seat to his death, met him 3 days later alive, and with the promise that I will go with you, went and changed the world. And the disciple-making thing, that's how movements go, right? Because when you kill someone, but they've reproduced 4 or 5 other people, and those 4 or 5 other people reproduced 4 or 5 other people, and they just kept doing that everywhere they went around the world. They just kept producing, and they kept trying to kill the most popular one, Try to kill the most popular one. Well, end the movement. That's how we end movements, kill the popular one. And no matter what they did, everywhere they went, they multiplied, 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 multiplied to where we stand today in this moment. If Jesus is alive, he changes everything. If Jesus is alive, he changes everything. Especially our definition of what it means to live our best life now. If Jesus is alive, he changes everything. If he's actually a real person, not a figment of my imagination, not some ghost, not some intuition I got in my heart, not just some feeling and goosebumps I get when we sing a cool song. If he's actually alive, a real God who knows me and runs the universe, then he changes everything, especially our definition of what it means to live our best life. I don't know about you, but that's a phrase being thrown around a lot these days. I see it all over social media. Every time I bump into people, you say, how you doing? And, anybody like this? I don't know about you. Maybe you're in this room and this is how you respond. But a fair amount of people are like, I'm living my best life. And I'm like, yeah, anyway, I won't say the word I want to say. That's not true. There are new people in the house. I'm going to try to act like a real pastor. That's not true. You're not living your best life. I just know people. You got the flu last week. You're poor. You're where I'm eating right now. You're not living your best life. If we're living our best life, we'd both be in Hawaii. We're not. And I don't know about you, but that phrase gets thrown around and there's this angst in us to live our best life. There's heavy pressure in us to live our best life. Well, why? Because life is short. We know. In fact, the older we get, we know more and more. I'm like, oh man, I'm getting close to 40, and how many more years on top of that can I go skiing and mountain climbing and jump on an air? I don't know. Things are getting tighter. Time is short. Gotta live my best life. Gotta live my best life. Oh, images, man. So social media is just crushing this. Oh, everyone's living their best life on social media. Man, every week I'm working, I'm like, man, other people just don't have a job. Gosh, man. I'm like, there's no way that you were on that mountain and on that float trip and in that place. And what do you do for a living? I know you're not rich. You dropped out of high school. But everyone's living their best life, which creates, and I think many of us, a deep FOMO, trying to be cool here, the fear of missing out, an anxiety that we're somehow not living our best life, that there is a best life to live, but we haven't quite reached it. We can't seem to get our hands around it. And then maybe we've convinced ourselves we're going for it. We are tasting life, touching life, going after life. We are living our best life. We are leveraging everything for our best life right now. We got it. No holding back. We're going for it. And if that's you, and it's been me, there are always things that seem to block the pathway to that. Number one, I screw up. Am I the only person? I want to live my best life, but I screw stuff up. I screw up relationships. I was talking to somebody the other day, and this person has found themselves to be very lonely because of some relational brokenness. And it seems like everywhere they go to find new friends, that relational brokenness follows them there. Trying to live your best life, that's hard to do when your reputation follows you, when your mistakes at the last place you were at follows you, when things you've done just never seem to just leave you alone. Things you've said, ways you've talked, ways you've acted, they just seem to always be there, the trail following behind you. Hard to live your best life. And no amount of acting like it didn't happen or it doesn't matter or you don't care what people think does one thing to make you feel better about it. And there's a lot of effort in that in the universe right now. There's a lot of attempts to say, well, here's what I'm gonna do. I'm just gonna act like what I did was fine. It's your fault you feel bad. I'm just gonna act like that thing that happened and that mistake I made and that addiction I had and that pride that I went through and that greed, hey, you know what, it's all fine. I'm just gonna wipe it away. It's all fine. I'm living my best life. I forget about it. It doesn't exist. It's okay. And not one bit of effort to do that does one thing to make you feel any better on the inside. You know, and if it's not your own screw-ups, it's just the pain of life. I mean, it's hard to live your best life when life comes and pops you in the mouth. I mean, every time you turn around, I don't know about you, but it seems like every time you turn around, you're like, all right, I got a week. I don't think anything bad's gonna happen. I'm gonna go for it. And then just stuff happens. People you love hurt. And things happen around you, and things happen at your job, and they happen in your family, and life just comes up and just goes, oh, you wanna live your best life? Pow! Try that. Live your best life now. Go for it. And then I think the last thing is that deep down, even if, and there's been a few brief moments in my life where I'm like, I'm doing it. Even in that moment, I don't know about you, but there's a deep sense that it isn't enough. There's a deep, deep sense that it just isn't as good as it could be. And I think that is true. And there is a reality to that actually points us to something deeper and something that lasts much longer. And I want to show you that. Many of you guys know here that come here, you know I normally have 2 or 3 sermons in one sermon. So this is my second sermon. But if Jesus is alive, then he redefines what it means to live our best life. And I want you to see this in Romans chapter 8. Romans chapter 8 and verse 11 says this: if the Spirit of him, that's God, who raised Jesus from the dead lives in you, he who raised Christ Jesus from the dead will also give life to your mortal bodies through his Spirit who dwells in you. That's a massive statement. If Jesus, who is risen from the dead, dwells in you, he who raised him from the dead will give life to your mortal bodies through his Spirit who dwells in you. What does it mean to live your best life? I'll tell you what it means to live your best life. It's the one who was dead, who was risen back to life, now lives inside of your dying body. That's what it means to live your best life. What a wild truth that the Spirit of him who was risen from the dead now dwells inside of those who put their confidence in him. So then, brothers, we are debtors. That means we have a deep debt, not to the flesh, not to live according to the impulses of our body and the impulses of our desires and the impulses of our flesh, to live according to the flesh. But if you live according to the flesh, you will die. In other words, if you give in to every impulse of your heart and desires and your want-tos, if you give in to all of that, you will die. But if by the Spirit you put to death the deeds of the body, you will live. For those who are led by the Spirit of God are sons and daughters of God. For we did not receive the spirit of slavery to fall back into fear, which is what the attempt to live our best life is. It's just slavery. When we see images of all the fun people are having and we go, man, that's what I gotta have to be happy, that's slavery. When I think somehow I've got to grab onto life and get all I can get before I die, that's slavery. It owns you and I when we give into it. And he says, yeah, but that's not what this Spirit, that's not what this resurrected King is doing inside of us. For you do not receive that spirit of slavery to fall back into fear, but you've received the spirit of adoption as sons, by whom we cry, Abba, Father. And here's what happens. When we put our confidence in a God who came down and lived as a man and died and rose again, when we put our confidence in him, he comes in, and that place of shame, that thing that nobody can tell you, they could tell you it was fine, they could tell you it was okay, they could say no big deal, they could say it doesn't matter, everyone else is doing it, it's no problem, you shouldn't feel bad about that, fine, it's okay. No matter what anybody says, you still feel shame. You still know it's there. And what the Spirit of God does is the Spirit of God crawls in and gets underneath all of that, and it goes, hey, you're a son. Yeah, but I'm a screw up. Hey, you're a daughter. Yeah, but I'm damaged goods. Hey, you're my kid. The Spirit of God gets inside and he gets behind all that shame and all that brokenness, and he goes, quiet. You belong to me. And there's no other way of alleviating that shame than to realize you belong to God as his child. And how does that reality sink in? It sinks in when we look at Jesus, who said, I went to a cross to take on the justice of my Father so that you could stand in grace and to know that you don't have to earn it, to know you don't have to achieve it, to know that your value was never determined by you, and it wasn't determined by that boyfriend or that girlfriend or that person who divorced you. It wasn't determined by your failures. It wasn't determined by how many friends you had. It wasn't determined by the dad that said you won't measure up. It was never determined by that. It was determined by God, who made you, died for you, and then crawls inside your skin and says, you're my son. You're my daughter. You belong to me. And that's the incredible reality of the resurrection. And so, if we're children, then we're heirs of God and fellow heirs with Christ, provided we suffer with him in order that we might be glorified with him. For I consider that the sufferings of this present time are not worth comparing with the glory that is to be revealed to us. In other words, if you're suffering now and you're not living your best life now, there's still hope. Because the suffering that Christ went through was just a pointer to a future. And the suffering of this life, all the things that don't measure up, all the things that are still broken, all the things that don't work out quite the way they should, the Spirit of God says, whoa, wait a minute. There's a future. There's a future coming where all things are made right. And that's the power of the resurrection. Jesus suffered, and in his suffering, he had his eye on the future. And it says when we suffer with him, it redefines our best life. This isn't it. This isn't it. And yet, in this moment, we can have incredible joy and incredible peace and incredible freedom when we know that the risen God is working in us to a future. That's the power of the resurrection. And so he says, verse 20, all creation, verse 19, all creation waits with eager longing for the revealing of the sons of God. For creation was subjected to futility, not willingly, but because of him who subjected it, in hope that creation itself would be set free from its bondage to decay and obtain the freedom of the glory of the children of God. In other words, all of creation is just as broken as we are. The universe we live in is just as broken as we are. And it's longing and waiting and hoping to be redeemed, just like we are. We're all waiting for more. In verse 24, for in this hope we are saved. In this hope we are saved. Craig can come back up, and I'm going to finish with this idea. it can be easy to go, hey, okay, I want to put my hope in Jesus. And then to go, what does that mean in terms of the joy that I'm going to experience tomorrow in my family, or the friendships that I have, or the work that I do? And is God just holding back until the end of time to give me all that he has for me? Is God just waiting at the end to kind of go, okay, all right, end of time, heaven, new earth, new body, new life, sin done away with, suffering over? Is that it? Or are we just here to kind of go, we're hanging on to a future? Is that what it's all about? And while the future is what it's all about, make no mistake, the future is what it is all about. Because in the future, nothing will roadblock your pathway to your best life. You cannot screw it up. You won't be able to. Not if the spirit of a resurrected king is living inside of you. And life and the brokenness of the universe around you won't exist anymore. But this deep sense that there's something more, the more you know Jesus, the deeper that sense is going to grow. The more that you encounter beauty from God, the more he gives you incredible relationships, the more he changes your character, the more he realigns your life to serve him, the more you do that, this deep sense is going to grow in you that there's more. That God has more, that he's doing more, that he has something in store for us, but it's better than we can imagine. And the more we taste him and touch him, the more he gets inside and frees us from shame. The more our desire is going to go, wow, there's got to be more than that. And there is. It's called the future. The future of the new heavens and the new earth, and a planet that isn't broken, and a body that's just the way God imagined it would be. And right now, he is working through our longings for that day. And he's not holding one thing back. You don't have to have a fear of missing out. God is not holding one thing back from you. In fact, check out what he says. Look at verse 31. What shall we say to these things, Paul says? If God is for us, who can be against us? He who did not spare his own son, but gave him up for us all, how will he not also with him graciously give us all things? If he didn't withhold his own son, he has nothing he's withholding from you. There's no relationship he can't heal. There's no shame he can't eradicate. There's no failure that he doesn't already know and love you straight through it anyway. There's no embarrassment. Nothing is being withheld from his sons and daughters. He's not like the parents maybe we grew up with, who maybe withheld things, maybe even their approval. Or maybe they withheld from us acceptance. He's not like that. He gives his children everything, namely his son. And when we wait with a longing for something more, we can know with confidence that our God has everything to give us.